Pilla talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem, whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, get a hold of him by calling his office or visiting his website, taxhelponline.com. If you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem is the tax system itself. So let's get into the issues of today. And we're going to talk about the tax protester movement, which is not a new thing. It has been around ever since taxes themselves. There's been someone who has been protesting it. One of my favorite things in architecture is tax avoidance architecture. You can actually go out and find different ways people avoid taxes by building around tax codes. It is one of the greatest things on the face of the planet. But in America, the tax protester movement kind of started up mostly in the 60s and 70s. And you, Dan, have a direct link to this protester movement because of your father. Your father was a tax protester in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s?
Yeah, Josh, that's exactly right. Your grandfather, my father, was immersed in the tax protester movement as deeply as anybody could get involved with it. He got in trouble with the IRS started in late 60s, manifested the early 70s is when the thing blew up. And so part of that was driven by the tax protester philosophy that you don't have to pay taxes, that taxes are voluntary, the tax laws are unconstitutional, the 16th Amendment was never properly ratified. All of these things were driving the thought process of these early tax protesters and the thought process of your grandfather. He lost his business as a result of it. He got in trouble with the IRS initially, then gravitated to the tax protester arguments as a means of trying to resolve the problem, which of course it only made it worse. And so that's how I cut my teeth, Josh, is on these tax protester cases. By the time I started my practice in the late 1970s, very late 70s, early 80s, most of the clients that I have were tax protester clients, meaning that these were people that were making these tax protester arguments at one level or another with the IRS administratively or in tax court or in the US district courts. And so I was seeing these arguments. These people were making these arguments. I was working with these folks that were making these arguments. And it became very apparent to me very quickly that the arguments just don't work. All right. Now, whatever basis you think you have in law for the support of these positions that filing a tax return is voluntary or the income tax is voluntary or it doesn't apply to U.S. citizens, whatever the strain of argument may be that you're making.
What it comes down to is however morally correct tax protesting may be, the IRS doesn't care. They're not about moral correctness. Their whole agency is about theft.
Okay. Okay. What you just did right there, Josh, is you created a second strain of argument. All right. So let's identify the two things that we're talking about here. On the one hand, what you talked about or alluded to is civil disobedience. Right? Civil disobedience is one thing, and the tax protester movement that's based on legal theories is something different. All right. Now, let me distinguish between the two of them because this is a very important distinction. The moral opposition to the tax code would suggest that the tax laws themselves are immoral, that the tax laws, that the use of the money, in particular, Josh, the use of the money to support the fraud and to support the foreign nations and to support the un-American type activities that so much of the tax revenue goes to support, the moral argument there would be, I am no longer going to comply with the law. So here's what civil disobedience says. Civil disobedience says, I recognize my legal obligation to file a return, pay the tax, but I have moral objections to the law, to the enforcement of the law, to the use of the revenue, and so I'm not going to comply with the law. That's civil disobedience. Now, people have a right to engage in civil disobedience, no doubt about that, and maybe you in your own heart have what you believe to be a moral obligation to engage in civil disobedience, but you need to understand there are consequences to civil disobedience, and we can talk about the consequences as we move on here. But that's civil disobedience. That's one thing. The tax protester movement is not grounded in civil disobedience the way I just defined it. The tax protester movement is using all kinds of variations of legal arguments, Josh, to say that they don't have the requirement to file a tax return or pay a tax. They're saying that the law doesn't require me to comply with the tax code. That's different than civil disobedience. So what these people are doing is, generally speaking, they're making all kinds of, and there are dozens of them, right? There's dozens of different legal arguments that they've concocted over the years. And I'm talking about decades here, over the decades of various elements. I talked about the tax return filing being voluntary, the payment of income tax being voluntary, the fact that wages aren't income, the fact that only foreign source income is taxable, that the tax laws only apply to federal employees. All these are various strains of legal arguments that they use to say that the law doesn't apply to me, so I don't have to file a return or pay taxes. So that's different from civil disobedience. Now, it's very important to understand that civil disobedience right from the get-go is a violation of law. And people that are engaged in knowing civil disobedience understand that they're breaking the law, and they're breaking the law to make a point. The tax protesters, generally speaking, don't believe they're breaking the law. The tax protesters, generally speaking, believe that this legal argument that's been concocted exempts them from having to comply with the law. And the problem with the tax protester arguments is they just simply don't work. The legal arguments they make are not valid legal arguments.
Isn't there like a hypothetically third option where maybe whether the arguments were good or not, the IRS is just like, no, we don't care. We want your money.
Oh, there's no question about that, Josh. That's absolutely true.
I mean, that's the third option. That's the second option I was pointed to. But you're right. There is obviously the civil disobedience route, which you have to know going into it. The IRS is going to come after me regardless. But because of all of this fraud, waste, duplication in the government, because of how they're wasting our tax dollars, driving up inflation, making things hard for the average citizen, I can't afford to pay my taxes, and so I will just choose not to. That's that for legal reasons. That is a hypothetical.
Yeah, and that is the mind frame, the basis of civil disobedience. I know the law requires me to do this. I'm not going to do this because of my moral reasons or ethical reasons or whatever reasons you have. And that's what drives it. But I said this before and I'll say it again. You need to understand, and people that go into a civil disobedience pattern with their eyes open definitely understand that there's going to be consequences to their actions.
Right. So now the 16th Amendment is the biggest center point for the tax protester movement, if I understand this correctly. First of all, what is the 16th Amendment?
Yeah, the 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913, Josh, and that's the amendment that gave the federal government the authority to assess and collect an income tax, a tax on incomes that didn't have to be apportioned, all right? And so I don't want to get real technical with this because we can really get into the woods, but let's just suffice it to say that the 16th Amendment is the amendment that created the modern income tax as we know it now.
And why do people seem to believe that this was never ratified? What is the confusion surrounding the 16th Amendment for the tax protester movement?
All right, so the theory with the 16th Amendment, and this is not crazy, by the way, because there was a lot of research, rock solid research that was done by a man named Red Beckman. Red Beckman was a guy from out west. This was done in the early 1980s. He went state by state and looked at every single state ratifying convention. Now, you understand that in order for a constitutional amendment to take effect, 2/3 of the states have to ratify that amendment in their state legislatures, and then it becomes an amendment to the Constitution. So Beckman went state by state and looked at the historical records in the various state archives to look at what happened with the ratifying conventions. And he proved with historical documents that the required number of states did not ratify the amendment, and that when the information was reported by the states to the Secretary of State of the to the United States government. I forget what the reporting chain actually involved, but he documented that when the ratifying information was received by the federal government, that the documents were falsified, and Congress then received false information that certain states ratified the amendment when in fact they had not. So Beckman wrote a book called The Law That Never Was. All right, and this was a very popular book in the early to mid 1980s, was circulated very widely, and people read that book and said, aha, the 16th Amendment wasn't legally ratified, and so therefore there can't be an income tax, and so therefore there can be no obligation to file a return and pay a tax. This was the argument that was structured. Now, what happened is, of course, that led to all kinds of litigation, because a number of people over the years, Josh, have been prosecuted criminally by the IRS for failing to file tax returns. The failure to file a tax return can be a criminal act under certain circumstances. It's rare, but it happens. But the IRS does prosecute these tax protesters pretty regularly under the criminal laws. Beckman himself was prosecuted for failure to file a tax return. And Beckman's defense, of course, was the fact that he personally did this research. He personally was the one that uncovered all the archived documents that showed that the ratification conventions were falsified and Congress was presented with false information. And Beckman himself was convicted. All right. So the thing is this, and this is a giant cop-out as to this particular argument, is the courts took the position that this is not a legal issue, this is a political issue. It's not for the courts to make a determination whether the 16th Amendment was properly ratified or not. It's for Congress to sort that out. And so the courts punted the issue, in my opinion, punted the issue away, and then took the position that the voluntary intentional act of not filing a return when a person should have known that they were supposed to file, or in fact did know that they were supposed to file, was the criminal act. So this is what happened with the 16th Amendment issue. There is a modicum of truth to that argument, but people need to understand it doesn't work. The courts reject it. They do not look at the argument from a legal standpoint. They take the position, as I said, that it's a political issue that Congress needs to sort out.
So they gave the issue over to Congress, who is directly paid out by the IRS, by the tax.
Well, and of course, the salaries of federal judges are paid by the tax system.
I was just going to say, and who writes the check to the judges who made this decision too? When it comes down to it, it doesn't matter whether the argument is good or not.
They want the money. And I've said this 1,000 times. You can take all 4 million words of the Internal Revenue Code and boil them down to just 3. And those 3 words are get the money. That's exactly what they're after. And we've got fundamental problems with the court systems here that take a look at these things, and that is they most certainly have a vested interest in propping up the system. And we see this from time to time in decisions that are issued by the various courts. If we do this, or if we do that, or if we take this position, or we take that position, the entire system will collapse. They're not going to let the system collapse. They just aren't going to do it. I wrote a treatise several years ago called A Monument of Deficient Wisdom. And that treatise was written on behalf of the Institute for Policy Innovation, and it was written in the very early 2000s, I think 2001 or 2002. It was part of the Roadmap to Tax Reform project that the Institute for Policy Innovation spearheaded back then, which led to the Bush tax cuts in 2021 and 2023. All right, so I was part of that project. I was a part of the editorial board of the Institute for Policy Innovation's Roadmap to Tax Reform project. And my job, Josh, was to talk about the constitutional friction, or I should say the friction, the legal friction between the Constitution and the Internal Revenue Code, with an idea toward abolishing the IRS and the income tax altogether. And what I did in that paper, and this paper is available on my website, taxhelponline.com, and the paper is called A Monument of Deficient Wisdom. And that's a quote from Hamilton and the Federalist Papers, where he talks about the mess, the complete mess of law that the colonies had made for themselves at the time of the founding of the Constitution. So anyway, what I did is I took every single one of the major principles of constitutional law and constitutional liberty: the right to jury trial, the right to the burden of proof and presumption of innocence, the Fourth Amendment right to protection, all of these various things. I went issue by issue, and I demonstrated how decisions of the Supreme Court have vitiated those constitutional protections. The Fifth Amendment is a perfect example. The Fifth Amendment gives you the right not to be a witness against yourself. But when you sign a tax return under penalty of perjury, the information in that tax return can be used against you for any kind of a prosecution, tax prosecution or a non-tax prosecution. So you are essentially required by law to be a witness against yourself. And the Supreme Court comes along and says, but that doesn't matter if it's a tax return because we need the money. All right. And so these are the kinds of things where the tax protesters get motivation when they look at these types of things and say, this is fundamentally wrong. It's fundamentally improper. To which I say, yeah, that is. They've twisted the Constitution beyond recognition, but it gets enforced. And this is what people need to understand. You take these positions, you're going to be fighting the IRS for years and years, in some cases, decades.
So what's the answer?
The answer, Josh, and you and I have had this discussion in the past, the answer is education. People need to be educated as to what's going on in this country. The problem that we have from an economic standpoint, and by that, the infiltration of socialism into the thought processes of Americans, in particular young Americans, is a matter of education. The decay of law in the United States, in particular, the rules of law regarding due process of law, for example, are a result of the lack of education. People do not understand what the Constitution says or means. The growth of the income tax code is another perfect example. People have no idea what the constitutional model of taxation is and how far away from that model this monstrous Internal Revenue Code is. All right, Josh, it's one thing after another when we're addressing these issues, and it all boils down to ignorance. People need to get educated. Our young people in particular need to get educated about what the nature of our government is, how our government was designed to be so unique and different from every other government in the world. Hereditary monarchy or tyrannical dictatorship, we are fundamentally different from that. The Constitution of the United States was an expression of the will of the people to create a government voluntarily, not through force, not through war, not by chance, but by a voluntary association of the people who understood that they had certain inalienable rights as natural human beings, and some of the power of the people was delegated to government to maintain peace and order. And we have come so far away from that as a result of profound ignorance that it's just not even funny. The solution to every problem that we're facing in America is fundamentally educating our young people to understand what the nature of this government is.
So why is the tax protester movement reemerging now in 2026? And I feel like I can answer that question on my own. I feel like that is a loaded question. I feel like anyone with a brain who is watching what's going on politically, socially, economically can tell you the answer to this question. But from a tax expert perspective, why is it back?
It's driven by frustration. There's no question about it. People, listen, the tax burden for the typical American, when you add up federal, state, and local taxes and all the hidden taxes, right? The excise taxes on gasoline and the sales taxes and all these things that people don't generally associate with a tax burden because you always see it right there, right? Like your federal income tax return, you sign the return, you say, whoa, look at all the money they got. But there's so many hidden taxes. When you add up federal, state, and local taxes, the typical person's paying about 40 or 45% of their income in taxes, Josh. And when you get into the high tax states like Minnesota, California, the states out east, New York and New Jersey and so on, the burden's even higher than that. So you are working for half your money. All right, now you add to that the inflation that's driving up the cost of living in every way, shape, and form, and people are struggling more and more. And then you add to that the waste, fraud, and duplication that's going on at every level of government. We see it in the state of Minnesota. They've identified upwards of $8 to $9 billion worth of fraud in the state of Minnesota. Billion is bad enough, right? It's huge levels of fraud. And this is going on at the federal level as well. You and I talked about the recent report of the, I believe, believe it was the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, that talked about the levels of fraud involved in the earned income tax credit and the various other refundable credits that are in the Internal Revenue Code. Billions. In the case of the federal government, Josh, it's hundreds of billions of dollars. And if we go back to the early 2000s, it's into the trillions of dollars of fraud that is going on with these various tax credits. And people see this stuff and they get frustrated. I'm working for a living. I got to get up at 5 in the morning to get to work. I got 2 kids I have to feed. They need shoes. We don't have the money for shoes because now gasoline is $4.50 a gallon. It's down now. But you understand my point. So this frustration.
Great.
Yes. So anyway, you understand my point, that this level of frustration is driving people to say, why should I pay these taxes when the people in Washington and the people in the capitals of the various 50 states around the country do not respect the time and effort it takes me to earn my money? They have no respect for the level of labor that I have to put forth to earn a living. They take half of my money and they just categorically waste it. Now, not every single dollar is wasted. We know that. We have police forces and fire teams and so on at the state level, and at the federal level, we got a national defense, which is constitutionally required. So not every dollar is wasted, Josh, but there's a darn good argument that 70 to 75% of the money is wasted on things that government should not be involved in.
And the truth of the matter is, even those categories that you can say, okay, those aren't waste, we need those categories. If you audited those categories, you're going to find 75% waste in those categories still.
And that certainly may be true. And the best example of that's probably the Department of Defense. In the roughly plus or minus $6.5 trillion of federal spending, about 900 billion of that is national defense. And don't tell me that you can't go through the books of the Defense Department, the War Department now, and find 20% waste. Don't tell me you can't. Of course you can. And government officials have a responsibility to respect the integrity of the taxpayer and the effort it takes the taxpayer to produce the income that these people take and then squander. It's reprehensible and it has to stop. Now, to the extent that drives civil disobedience, that's certainly understandable. I don't condone it. I don't recommend that people do it, but I certainly understand where it's coming from.
When the only answer to why should I pay my taxes is because otherwise they'll put you in a cage, not because we get XYZ, because they're doing good. If the only answer is because they're going to come and get you otherwise, the government has a problem. They have a big problem.
Well, there's no question about it. When people don't want to voluntarily pay their share, I hate to use the word fair share, and I'm not going to, but because that's
and I hate to use the word voluntary too, because
and that's one of the tax protester arguments, by the way, that people have used for years, that the tax laws are voluntary, and the IRS uses that phrase voluntary compliance in their own literature, and it says right here, our system is a system of voluntary compliance. Guess what? I choose not to volunteer. How do you like that? It's just, of course, that's not what they mean by voluntary compliance. What they mean by voluntary compliance is that you fulfill the obligations that you have under the law without the need of IRS intervention. That's voluntary compliance.
The voluntary compliance means the consequences come after you don't file your taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't come to your door, knock on the door and say, give me your money right now.
And it's just like the example of driving your car at 2:00 in the morning on deserted city streets, and you come to a red light. Do you stop your car at the red light at 2:00 in the morning, even though there's no other cars around? The answer is yes, you do. There's not a police officer in their car holding a gun at your head. You quote unquote voluntarily stop the car, but you voluntarily stop the car under the pain of a ticket, of law enforcement interaction, if by some reason there happens to be a cop sitting behind the billboard on the other side of the street and happens to see you drive through the red light. Right? So it's not voluntary in the sense that I've got the free choice to do it or not do it. That's really what voluntary means. I've got the free choice to do it or not. It doesn't mean that at all. It means
I got the free choice to either do it or go to jail. That's my free choice.
Yeah, Josh, it's the Vito Corleone. It's the Vito Corleone definition of voluntary. Either your brains or your signature will be on the contract. Okay, I'll sign. Did you voluntarily sign the contract? I don't think so. So these tax protester arguments, Josh, they're like garden weeds. They just don't ever go away. And I've done a tremendous amount of writing.
It's almost a function rather than a bug in the system. Tax protester movements are not a bug in this system. It is a direct response
to an oppressive system. Look, here's the reality. The lower the tax burden and the easier it is to comply with the law, the more willing people are to file and pay, to do what they're supposed to do. Whether it's file or not, doesn't matter. The simpler the law and the lower the financial burden, the more likely it is that people are going to willingly comply and do what they're supposed to do. And we saw this all throughout the 50s and 60s, generally speaking. The average citizen didn't have much of a tax burden, and the tax code was very simple, and the tax return preparation process was very simple. Now we have a tax code that consists of more than 4 million words that were changed more than 6,000 times in the last 25 years. We've got a burden that now, as I said, has taken 40 to 45, in some cases 50% of a person's income. This is what drives noncompliance. And I've talked about this over and over again. And I talked about this in my testimony to Congress when I testified to the Senate Finance Committee way back in the 1990s on the abolition of the income tax at that time. A complicated system drives noncompliance. High tax burdens drive noncompliance. If you want to increase compliance and decrease the level of apprehension that people have with complying with the tax code, simplify the damn thing. So abolish the Internal Revenue Code the way we have it now and go to a far simpler system.
At what point do we have to, as a country, realize that they don't want to simplify it? The complexity is by design, and they want to exert the control, and the non-compliance enforcement isn't something that they are doing because they need the money. They're doing it because
they want the control. There's no question about that. I made that very point, Josh, in my book, How to Fire the IRS, which was released in 1993. We're talking, is that 40 years ago? No, it's not 40, but it's a long time ago.
Coming up on 30.
The complicated tax code is about maintaining control, and it's about keeping the lever, or the leverage, I should say, over people, because when you've got a complicated tax code, people never know whether they did it right or not. Look at right now, we're in a situation where about 80% of the taxpayers use some kind of professional tax preparer to do their return, whether it's a CPA or an enrolled agent, or they buy professional tax preparation software like TurboTax, one of those software programs, to do the return for them. When they're all finished with the tax return, they sign the return and they have no idea whether that tax return is correct or not. And I believe that the IRS wants it that way, because then when the IRS comes along and says, oh, you made a mistake here, you made a mistake there, people are in no position to know whether the IRS is correct or not. And so generally they cave in and roll over. And even professional tax preparers don't understand, I should say, not all professional tax preparers understand how to push back against the IRS. And so even in situations where you've had a hotshot CPA or an enrolled agent prepare your tax return, if the IRS challenges that return, they can explain the tax return just fine, but they can't always challenge the IRS. They don't know how to execute an appeal. They certainly don't know how to prosecute a tax court case if it comes to that. And so this is why people roll over and just pay. And it's the confusing, complex tax code that allows the IRS to get away with this crap.
So we already discussed that the answer to this is education. You got to talk to your congresspeople, you got to talk to your local representatives, and you have to get this information to the people so that they understand what their rights are as taxpayers, so that we can maybe get a handle on this system that is completely overwhelming and oppressive. But Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights crusade.
Yeah, I'm at TaxHelpOnline, and I'm at Pilla Talks Taxes. I'm on the social media outlets, Truth Social, TikTok, LinkedIn, my long form videos right here on and of course we're on Facebook. So follow me on these places, like the videos, share the videos, especially with your state and federal representatives. And if you've got a problem with the IRS, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com. Buy any book off my website at any price point, and you get a free 15-minute consultation directly and personally with me. And if you are involved in the tax protester movement, or you're thinking about getting involved in tax protester activity, for heaven's sakes, talk to me. I can save you all the agony in the world by coaching you through the process of getting out of it if you're in it, and not getting into it if you're thinking about getting into it. And I understand the attraction, but friends, I'm telling you, you're asking for an awful lot of agony if you follow that course. So go to my website, taxhelponline.com, and let me help you start solving your tax problem today.